just got this email from a dude named Andrew, and I think it's broadly representative of how a lot of Australians are feeling right now about their next ute, if you're in the market for a replacement. And I think we'll just let Andrew rip and you can hear what he has to say. I'm trying to see through all the negatives that us Australians seem to pile on any product that comes out of China. I have to admit, I'm finding myself joining the masses of flinging shit at everyone and everything these days. But I like the GWM Canon Alpha plug-in hybrid, and I'm not embarrassed to say I want one and I don't care what my mates say. My wife is crook, seriously. So we bought a brand new caravan. We can no longer camp in a tent together. I retired to look after her. What next? I drive a 2016 SR Hilux 6-speed manual that was initially set up for touring. We've done the likes of the Canning stock route and so forth in the past, so we're not like the Chardonnay caravan park mob, no offence to them. But we do have our reasons to buy a van. My Hilux, on the other hand, is now overweight, wrongly set up to tow, etc, etc. Our van weighs 2 tonnes, our tow vehicle is a little heavier, that's a tick. Our tow vehicle is just a little agricultural in comfort. The suspension is set up to carry weight, so towing, she's a bit rough. We love her, but the Canon is so appealing in many ways. Hybrid, towing capacity, super comfortable, coil-sprung rear end, affordable for a retiree. When we're not touring, we can use the electric drive around town. Also, if I do decide to head off alone, I can do moderate off-road tours to my favourite places without a worry. I hope you're still awake, John. We want to tow in comfort in a vehicle that is reliable and safe. That's the crux of it. Your thoughts, please. Well, thanks very much for reaching out, Andrew, and I must say I'm sorry to hear about the condition of your wife, mate. That must be pretty difficult, and hats off to you for making the sacrifices that you've had to make her life better, so well done there. And I can relate, because for the past few years now, my aging father, who's nearly 90, has been ill with melanoma, and I'd have to say that ordeals such as this are endurance events. So keep your chin up and look at it on the bright side. You get to do things that perhaps you otherwise wouldn't have been able to. I know that's the case with me and my dad, because as a perverse consequence of his condition, we've spent so much more time together than we otherwise would have, and that's been really good for him and really good for me as well. So it's not all bleak, I'm sure. You get to go to fun places in your case. Anyway, I'm on foot now in the core network looking for a Canon Alpha plug-in hybrid right now. In fact, that's why I'm here. I'm going to be driving it for a week. I'm about to pick it up, and I'll give you my honest first impressions in just a moment. I'll hook this camera up and drive it back and tell you what I think off the bat. Just here's how it feels. But before we do that, I think there's a fundamental thing that needs to be better addressed here, which is not all Chinese brands are the same. Some Chinese brands in Australia are very new indeed, right? They've been here for weeks or days in some cases, right? And we don't have much of a track record or other information to go on about exactly how they're going. Not the case with GWM. In fact, this month, in June of 2025, GWM is going to celebrate its 16th year of operation in Australia, right? Like, how long do you have to be here before you get some sort of, I don't know, badge of recognition? And this means, of course, that there is a dealer network and spare parts inventory. There's been ongoing technical training and things of that nature. I mean, they've got the full setup in-house in Australia, and it's operationally mature. You can't say that about, I don't know, Xpeng or Polestar. And I'm not having a dead set shot at those brands either. They're fledgling brands in Australia, and surely that means they have to earn their stripes. And when you look at it on fundamentals, 300 kilowatt ute with multi-speed transmission, low range, diff locks, which you can also drive in EV mode to the office and back, that's got to be worth serious consideration. as opposed to just denigration because Chinese. Anyway, let's walk in now and pick that car up, and I'll talk to you about how it feels seconds after getting in and driving for the very first time. Okay, so literally picked this car up 50 meters ago, and first impressions are this is what a Hilux could be in 30 years time when they get around to, you know, modernizing it. It is very luxurious in here compared with the median Australian ute, you know, like it just is. There are some tacky little inclusions, like not a big fan, you probably can't see it from there, you might be able to see just a little bit of this. There's a sort of faux plastic wood which is not doing the interior any favors, but the rest of it is pretty polished. Nice big screen for the nav with Android Auto running, and there's a few analog controls for the air and things of that nature, hazard lights. There's even a nice little touch for the watch aficionados down here with an old-timey watch bezel just down here in the center stack, well, where the center stack would be if there were one. So it's really quiet too, even with the combustion engine running. And you know, if you took the average Australian car buyer's sort of default perception of made in China when it comes to cars and things of that nature, then this would not be that. In fact, if you covered up the badges, it would be a real struggle for many people, I'm sure, to make sense of exactly where this car comes from. It's super quiet. There is a little bit of stuff in the back from the launch which is rattling around a little bit, but the car itself feels like it's got, you know, high levels of body integrity, and there's plenty of vision. I'd have to say that the view from the rear vision mirrors is not class leading, although, you know, it's not difficult to see around, and it certainly doesn't feel as if it weighs like 2.9 tons. Quite the opposite. It feels pretty nimble for this inner city driving. We're in Marrickville at the moment driving around, so I don't think we'll be stretching the vehicle's sort of 300 kilowatt legs anytime soon, but there'll be plenty of time for that over the coming week. The rear window's interesting because it opens electrically. It's one of those little sliders like the American trucks have, so obviously they've taken some design inspiration from that. Now, obviously about a week ago I got out of a Ram 1500, so this doesn't feel all that big, but it is quite a big ute when you compare it with my Triton or plenty of the other sort of median, quote-unquote, Japanese utes in Australia, which are all made in Thailand, except for the Amarok, which is made in South Africa, where they have lions and tigers incentivizing the workforce kind of thing. But yeah, all of the Japanese utes, they're almost like, you know, the way pimps do Cadillacs to me, because they started out and they're still designed fundamentally to be worked in mines and things of that nature, and then the various car manufacturers figured out they could make a shit ton of cash if all they did was just add fruit and add fruit and add fruit and convince people that they were actually civilized. The worst thing, and it's so glaring about this ute off the bat, is that the battery is clearly between the rear axle and the tailgate under the floor, and for this reason there is no spare tire mounting under there anymore. Like if you get a Canon Alpha that's not a plug-in, the spare tire is under the floor in between the differential and the tow bar kind of thing, whereas that's not possible here because there's that 2-stack battery in this car that's jammed into that space. So what they've done, and this is like a ultimate afterthought kind of thing, is they've just jammed a spare tire against the right hand wall of the mudguard inside the tray, you know, and that's terrible. At least they've taken the vinyl cover off. That comes with a vinyl cover, but the cover blows off at highway speeds, and it's just ultimate sort of band-aid, because you'd never be able to sell a ute in Australia without a spare tyre, I don't think. So it has one, but the solution, if you could call it that, is third rate at best. Not wanting to heap shit on them too much, because I guess one of the opportunities that they did discuss was, let's not give it a freaking spare tyre at all, which would just be an unmitigated disaster. So I'm glad it's got one. The solution is terrible. You'd have to figure out something else, like a rear mounted carrier, or even maybe a roof rack type carrier. There's a dirty big sunroof here, but there is seemingly about 450 millimeters of roof space behind the sunroof, where you might be able to get a couple of crossbars and use that to mount the spare. That's my initial thought on where I might like to do that if I actually own one. On a more positive note, on a much happier, more positive note about this and that, one of the really cool things about this car is the ride quality. Like you can see right now, the ride quality it's awesome. And that's mainly coming from the rear end, because the rear end is coil sprung. Right now, I'm not exactly sure how coil springing the rear is going to play into its ability to tow a really heavy van or something, but when it comes to just ambient ride quality around town, most of the utes that I drive are terrible when they're unladen and you're doing this traffic hump stuff that we're doing now. I'm driving on a road that was probably put down 40 years ago. It's got gaps like this between individual concrete slabs every, I don't know, 6 or 7 meters or something. And just generally, the surface quality of this road in particular is awful, as you'd expect for something in the inner city that hasn't had a birthday since Gough Whitlam was the Prime Minister, sort of thing. So it's coping with that really well. And from a bit of personal experience, I can tell you that it is hard to cope with. I know it's a first world problem, but it is hard to cop the shit ride quality, right, of default utes when they're unladen, especially if that's how you roll in yours. It's different if you're a tradie and you've always got, 600 kilos in the back and 2 beefy boys up the front, sort of thing. Or I guess if you're towing a big van with your big family in it and you're doing the big lap, that's kind of going to mitigate the ride quality as well, because you'll have the springs will be loaded up and the car will be doing its thing. But if you're just driving around like it's your ute for play, but it's also your daily transport around the burbs kind of thing, then this would have to be one of the better riding utes. Navara's a bit like that too, in the upmarket variants with the coil sprung and the multi-link rear end, but it does suffer from a heavy towing point of view. So horses for courses there, I think. 3.5 tons worth of tow capacity is generally bullshit in cars such as this from a practical point of view, because if, let's say it's 800 kilos worth of payload for argument's sake, you put a 3.5 ton van on, that's going to give you 350 kilos on the tow ball, which is going to take 350 away from whatever you can put in your ute and in the tray, like in the cabin and in the tray and the accessories, right? So if you are tooling up for an outback adventure, you're down to 450 off the bat before you fit any accessories, before you carry any recovery gear or water or things of that nature, fire extinguisher and all of that crap that you really should be taking on any self-respecting trip to the outback. And then, how many people are you going to take? Even if it's only 2 people, you have to acknowledge that 2 people is going to be the best part of 200 kilos by the time you've got some personal effects. And then if you allowed 150 kilos for personal effect, for the stuff that you've got to take, like a fire extinguisher and water and spare fuel maybe and a bit of recovery equipment and all of that stuff. By the time you got all of that in your ute, you really don't have very much room for something else. And then you're going to be doing thousands upon thousands of kilometers of driving in remote and unforgiving locations with the vehicle extremely heavily loaded, close to its maximum. I would argue that this is a bad idea, not just in this car, but in any dual cab ute, right? So what I actually think is, that this car might be the best kind of ute for towing, let's say, 2 to 2.5 tons. Because it is actually quite a big vehicle, like it's long and it's heavy. Therefore, its inertial restraint inherently, by virtue of its size and its weight, the moment of inertia of this vehicle is quite high, and that means that its capacity to restrain the degrees of freedom of the trailer behind it is quite high. Like pig type trailers that we use in Australia are inherently unstable in pitch and in particular in yaw, which is why there are so many loss of control failures when the trailers are very heavy relative to the vehicle towing them and the loading of the trailer is dodgy, right? The trailer behaves like a pendulum. The inertia of the vehicle doing the towing is insufficient to constrain that, and all of a sudden trailer overtakes the car when the pendulum goes from this way to this way, and you park on the roof, often with disastrous consequences for the humans involved, right? It's already disaster for the equipment, but I think if no one gets hurt, we can all laugh at you, you know? So this might be a really good option for towing the sort of load that I would consider to be responsible for your average ute. You know, it could be really good at that, just because it's so freaking heavy. I don't know that we're saving the planet, you know, 2.9 tons of ute at a time, but if we put saving the planet to one side and we look at civility, refinement, you know, versatility is a big thing. Tray's actually quite big for a dual cab, so you can fit a lot of stuff in there, and I'd suggest that if you're not towing something heavy, 700 and whatever it is kilos of payload is actually quite reasonable indeed. You know, like you can fit a lot of stuff in a car. You can fit the family in and go to Bunnings and put some heavy stuff in for the Renaults and bring them home, and hopefully you can conscript the strapping young teenagers to give you a hand busting a gut, getting it all out of the car and on site wherever it's going to go. Good luck with that. But if you separate load carrying from towing and wanting to have it all, right? People want to do it all. They want to load the vehicle heavily and tow maximum trailer and be 60 and still desirable to the opposite sex, and freaking they want the chocolatey delight that's also good at preventing tooth decay kind of thing. You just don't get that, and I'd suggest that if we all concentrated instead on what are we actually going to do with our ute. We want to tow a 2.5 ton trailer. Okay, it'll probably be good at that. If we want to carry some heavy stuff back from Bunnings, it'll probably be good at that. If we wanted to go camping and have a bit of a 4x4 adventure, it'd probably be pretty good at that. If we wanted to max it out in every respect, it'd be like all other machines when you max them out at every respect. It'll reduce their lifespan and be a fairly shit experience, I'd suggest. So as long as you're kind of realistic about what you want to do, then to me this is a real alternative to a Hilux, a Ranger, Triton, D-Max, BT50 kind of thing, simply because it offers you something different which those other vehicles do not offer, right? Those other vehicles simply do not offer the ability to drive, you know, quote unquote zero tailpipe emissions way to the office and back. Whereas if you're a leadfoot, obviously the combustion engine is going to be part of the show, but you can operate it if you drive gently in EV mode. It'll deliver 115 k's of range depending on the conditions, depending on how aggressively you're using the air conditioning and things of that nature. So that's a point of difference, right? That might matter. You might be able to do your driving 5 days a week in zero emissions mode. You might fit a fast charger at home and just charge it up twice a week using off-peak electricity. That kind of makes sense. It's going to be cheaper than petrol, although frankly does it really make any difference to you if it's cheaper when, you know, you're spending $65,000 on the vehicle to start with. So I guess what you've got to do is weigh all of this stuff up and come up with a reasonable answer that makes sense for you. But first impressions, driving it as a complete, you know, fish out of water. I've gone from Marrickville, I'm in Newtown now, I've come via Erskineville kind of thing, and these are not the conditions that this vehicle is designed to operate in optimally, clearly, right? Because everything's a bit like this, and, you know, there's not too much ute goodness to be exploited here if you think about the most efficient vehicle for these circumstances. But if you also wanted to go camping and do a bit of towing and you had a place in the bush or whatever, then I'm a fan of this. And I'm also a bit of a fan versus an EV, because frankly, you could drive a long distance in this car without the special ops planning, right? If you've got an EV and you want to go a long distance in Australia, it's like SEAL Team 6 taking out Osama bin Laden. You've got to do planning like that vis-a-vis the charges and all of that crap, because it's so easy to get to a charger that's just not working or whatever. And if you're in that situation with an EV, it's very stressful, whereas you're only using a little bit more hydrocarbon energy in a vehicle like this, and you absolutely eliminate all of the worry and all of the risk and that kind of thing about, you know, everything that can get you stranded when chargers fall over in remote locations in an EV. So for that reason, I'm a fan. And I also think, you know, if we wanted to make better use of the planet's nickel, manganese and cobalt resources, we'd be better off tipping them into vehicles such as this versus tipping them into dedicated standalone battery electric vehicles, simply because there's so much extra material of that nature required for those vehicles. You know, you need so much more nickel and so much more manganese and cobalt for a 77, 80 kilowatt hour battery that some of these big fat EVs have got. It's only half the amount of those precious heavy metals in vehicles such as this. So you might not be able to do twice as good a job, but you could do certainly better than the job a standalone battery EV would do in a pragmatic sense driving around the city. So for all these reasons, I've only been in it for as long as I've been talking to you, but this is a pretty nice conveyance. It's much better than the average person's perception of Chinese ute, you know? If you said, where was this made, to your average punter, cover up the badge, which doesn't really tell you who made it anyway, at least not here. If you did that, it's like, yeah, you'd be saying, I don't know, Europe kind of thing, because it feels European to me, certainly to drive around here. Anyway, I'll get back to you with more once I've had longer behind the wheel, but thanks for coming with me on this little odyssey today, and I hope that helps Andrew and his sick wife, who I hope gets as much better as she can in the circumstances. Catch you next time.